to all our viewers around the world. There's a live streaming on the pandemic and the economic fallout. I'm Chen Lei, CGTN's business anchor, and it's an honor to moderate this discussion. Let me introduce my special guests. We've got Nobel laureate economist Michael Spence joining us from Milan in the region of Lombardy in Italy, and from Eastern China's Hangzhou, Professor Chen Long, managing director of the Law Academy. I'm in Beijing. So, former British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill is credited as having said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." We're not at physical war, but we are fighting a global battle of profound dimensions. So, what can the world learn from China and Italy's disease control playbook as they fight the spread of COVID-19, which has already taken 10,000 lives worldwide? And how do we balance this double battle of virus and recession? Well, let me ask you first, Michael, because you're in the epicenter of the European outbreak. You're in a country with the weakest economic fundamentals and the most precarious politics. What's it like over there? I mean, what do you make of the government's efforts so far to prevent and control the pandemic?
Well, we are, just for your viewers, we are, the data are quite bad here. We have well over 40,000 confirmed infections and over 4,000 deaths due to the virus, and we'll get into sort of more about data later on. And we're in a kind of the fourth week or a month-long process of increasingly strict restrictions that probably are moving in the direction of what you've experienced in China. I would say the government, all the Western governments, including ours, were late to start. We kind of watched China and sort of thought, well, that's far away, maybe there'll be some problem at the borders and so on. But we didn't really understand that the virus was probably spreading invisibly underneath our feet, so to speak. And so everybody has a late start. Italy happens to be ahead of everybody else on these exponential curves that we're used to, but we're not unusual in that late start. Having said that, I think the government and other institutions are doing everything they can now. Not just restrictions, but the medical system here in the north is really quite good, but it's simply overwhelmed. And that's, again, a function of the late start late. So that's a kind of snapshot of what it's like. We are locked down nationwide. No schools, not even walking very far from your house.
You were talking about the tram lines just outside your apartment with trams carrying 1 or 2 passengers.
Yeah, so our transportation system's pretty good. People who work use the trams, so they've kept the trams running. But when you look out the window during the day and watch these trams go by, it's not uncommon to see them either empty or with 2 people or 1 or 2 people in them at a considerable distance from each other. They're big trams. That's just an indication. So we're in the feel of it when you will look outside is the ghost city feel that you would have experienced in China at the high point of the lockdowns.
Well, Beijing, thankfully, is returning to some quasi-normalcy. So, Professor Chen, as China gets this thing under control and is now bracing for imported infections, what do you think Italy and the rest of the world can take away from the China experience?
Yeah, firstly, I think it's sad to hear what Michael described. It really sounds very familiar because that was what happened in China. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can
hear you fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so because that was what happened in China. So in a sense, we can say that, as Winston Churchill said, you never want to waste a good crisis, but I feel that China's lesson was somehow wasted. And it amazed me that how long it takes people to absorb information into their perception. So if you look back at what happened in China. So actually, China has announced the complete closure and shutdown of Wuhan back on January 22nd and 23rd. which was precisely 2 months ago. And at that time, so it was already clear.
At that time, everyone thought it was heavy-handed.
Yeah, at that time, but actually it was already very clear to Chinese that leaving it alone is not an option. It was precisely actually the so-called herd immunity people were talking about last week. But 2 months ago, we already knew it is not an option. We don't have a choice. So at that time, China decided that it's going to shut down Wuhan. And rather than taking China as a whole, it actually separates Wuhan and Hubei and the rest of China. So then it also essentially quickly conducted a complete lockdown of normal activities in most of China. And then within Wuhan, actually, we decided to provide a lot of medical support, including building 2 large-scale hospitals within 2 weeks that can take 2,600 new patients. And also it quickly maneuvered the production powers across China to boost the production of the related medical supply by tenfold. It also started to send tens of thousands of medical experts and staff to Wuhan. And outside of the Hubei, it's different. So we took a lot of other measures. So within a couple of weeks, we can see that the China's situation has been stabilized, and you can see that the new identified cases coming down. So from within 2 weeks of that shutdown, it has already becomes clear that certain combination of extensive testing, case isolation, contact tracing, social distancing, personal health conducts can effectively control the spread of virus. Now, so this whole thing, and that also is exactly the experience many East Asian countries experience. So they all have some certain degrees of success. So it already has become very clear that to China and East of Asia, but somehow this was not, it's really understudied. It was not taken in. So
yeah, they thought we're different. It's not going to happen to us. Yeah.
Exactly. They think it's a foreign, and so it's not happening to us. But the bad part of that is we're really paying a heavy price for this. Now it has become a pandemic. It becomes rampant in Europe and the United States. But what's worse, it's not just threatening people's life and health. It has completely changed the global economic trajectory. That threw away all the previous forecasts out of the window. So when we're combating this in China, we thought that we're going to control this. And as a very small case, it will spread to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, it's happening right now. And this is a very bad result. But that's the lesson right now.
Michael, do you want to come in on this? The reasons that other developed countries wasted this opportunity?
You know, I think people will study this for a long period of time, and it's a really important question about whether we can. First of all, I think we just move more slowly in the West. I mean, China is famous for being able to mobilize resources once it gets the hang of it, and there's a real challenge, whether it's congestion and lack of capacity in ports or a number of other things, or those of us who've had the privilege of being around know this. And we're just not able to do that. So we here in Italy, for example, and we're not unique, have a serious shortage of the ventilating machines. So we're having to make really, really difficult choices, meaning the doctors and the medical staff about who's going to be saved and who's not. But I don't think we can. We are trying to build an additional medical facility in the old fairgrounds and so on. So I don't want to suggest that everybody's fallen asleep, but I just don't think we have the capacity to mobilize fast enough. So that's point one. The second point, which I think is important, is that it has to do with what an economist would call unobserved variables. So basically, what you have is a situation in which the reported data tell you the number of confirmed cases. If you have limited testing capability, that number can be pretty low. And it's a whole lot lower, at least in the early stages, than the number of cases there are, because there's a delay before any of them show up. And then even then, some of them don't show up until they actually turn
a whole
into
lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, not only infected a whole, yeah, exactly. Infected a whole lot of people are serious enough so if somebody actually reports in to a doctor. I mean, some of these cases are asymptomatic. So this delay, you know, which I think of as sort of on the order of 2 weeks before things start to show up in the data, I think gave people the kind of very, very misleading and unfortunate impression that this was a terrible problem, you know, in Asia, specifically in China, but that hadn't really become a serious problem here until all of a sudden it was. And by here, I'm not speaking only of Italy. We're on different trajectories. So Italy's ahead of the rest of Europe. Spain's not far behind. Others are, you can see the curves coming. And America is clearly on the upswing as well, in spite of the recently imposed provisions.
So, Professor Chen, you know, we talk about the developed countries that have been caught unprepared. What about developing nations that have weak national health systems? How should they prepare? What are best policies there?
Yeah, that's a good follow-up on the lessons we have learned. So I guess the first lesson is that we have wasted a crisis in China to understand this. Now we're paying a heavy price, but this is not the end of it. We're really in the middle of this. And if we don't really learn from this, a much bigger price we have to pay. So I think critically right now, we need leadership and coordination. Now, so a big part of this, as we mentioned earlier, is that a lot of people think that it's not my problem. But really now we have learned that virus knows no boundary. So the only boundary, the border that matters is between humanity and the virus. So we have to coordinate. So a big problem is that this thing is not their problem. So what we have learned right now is that the key is to share the information and the knowledge, to prepare ahead, use the right approach, and act in a coordinated way. We're not separate. You see, right now, China has kind of successfully controlled. Now, almost all of the cases now come from the abroad. So we're not separate. We can never be separate. So that is, we're at different trajectories, as you mentioned. And now there are many other countries. It's not quite happening yet. But if you don't pay, so another thing we have learned is that it's dynamic. The earlier you are prepared, medical preparedness, you know, the habits, to prepare all the lessons we have learned from China, from other countries, then it's much easier to control. Now, if you let it out of hand, then even it's in the very advanced countries, then wealthy countries are going to have a lot of problems. So think about the countries with poor medical support, with a huge, large population. If they get infected, then that will become a much bigger disaster. So I think for the rest of the world, for Europe, for Africa, a lot of places, I think they really have to get going. And we have to help each other. For the countries who are already ahead of the curve, they have to turn around to share the information, to help them with their expertise, the so-called expertise through the lessons. And so they really have to inform each other. Otherwise, we're connected in both battle against the virus and the battle against the recessions, which is we're going to talk a bit later.
Yeah, Michael, I'm sure you've been observing how different countries have approached this pandemic. Which countries or regions would you say have done really well?
I mean, it's pretty clear so far that the subset of Asian countries have done well. So China, which get a lot, I mean, I think from outside looks like it let it get a bit out of hand and missed some opportunities early on, then got on it very quickly. Hong Kong, which is right next door, you know, that part of China, has had a slightly different approach, but looks like it's been extremely effective in holding down both the number of cases and the deaths. Again, another part of China, Taiwan, so looks like it's done pretty well. Singapore, you know, kind of got hit pretty hard at the start, and with a lot of imported cases, but then they kind of flattened out the curve, to use the term of art these days, pretty quickly. I don't think there's anything yet that looks even approximately as effective in anywhere else. Having said that, we just don't know. I mean, these lags really matter. So we went into kind of pretty full lockdown here about a week ago. So I'm sure there are people who are discouraged that we're not seeing an immediate drop in the infection rate and the number of deaths. But there wasn't any chance of that. What we're seeing in the data that flows out every day is the result of the less regulated and less careful and all that regime that we were under before. It's not that we did nothing, but we closed schools and universities and life went on, and that's clearly not enough. So the answer to your question is, so far, a set of Asian countries have done the best job. And we speculate that they were better prepared, they had knowledgeable people, they had equipment and supplies, and when they didn't, then as in China, they moved quickly. Probably China helped a lot because of its enormous capacity once it gets going. And they had previous experience, specifically the first SARS epidemic, so they kind of knew what they were doing. I don't think, for example, and then I'll stop here, I don't think we're, good at tracking, taking a case and then tracking the exposures and working that through. So we're very heavily dependent on social distancing because I don't think we have the capacity right now to do that much more detailed kind of network-like tracking of people that might have been infected.
Professor Chen, do you want to talk about the impact of or the effect of lifestyles and social structures on the spread of the pandemic? What we're seeing in Japan, for example, people have the habit of wearing masks, and socially, I think they're more isolated versus the very communal and gregarious Italians. To what extent do you think that's a factor?
But let me follow up on the Michael's response a little bit. So I think when we talk about, I think the one lesson is that people think China is different. A lot of times people think China is different, but actually, if we think about in retrospective, all the approaches people are taking are not that different. It's a combination of several things. So essentially, you just have to. It cannot be left alone. So it takes so long for people to figure that out.
But everyone tries to reinvent the wheel first, haven't you discovered?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So they think they're different. But now,
and then
actually,
they come back to this
all those countries,
model.
They're not that different. It's just a combination of those measures are a little bit different. But otherwise, you cannot leave that alone. You have to have build your medical support capacity, and you have to have all those non-medical approaches like the social distancing, is the case isolation, etc. And if you have good use of digital technology that can trace the cases, it's like the live health status, that would be more effective. But somehow those combination works. So I think they are kind of similar. Then to follow up, then I think it's not as bad. So as I think coming to Michael's point, it's really like it was China 2 months ago, essentially, if you want to think this way. And we learned that after Wuhan was shut down, essentially within 2 weeks, we can see clear symptoms actually stabilize. So I think, but that at that time, and initially it felt bleak. So I think let's see what happens. There are a lot of successful cases, but coming back to what you said, but I think it will really fundamentally change people's social behavior for quite a while. The reason is that this time there are actually two battles. You can call this pandemic. So you see, if you want to control the virus, you really want to shut down pretty much all the activities. But then that will hurt people and the business tremendously. So if you want to stimulate the economy, then you really want to stimulate everything, the economics get going. But then the problem is that you cannot go either extreme. So that means it's going to be balanced for quite a while. People have to be used to have some kind of preventative measures against the virus while they're trying to recover from economy. You cannot go either way. So that's the hard part of this time. And that also means we have to change our social behavior. The social distancing is here in some way, and it also changes how we, our health habits, all those kind of stuff. It's going to be there for quite a while, I think. And that's just one example. It's going to affect in many other ways.
Yeah, that's why we're doing this live streaming from 3 different places rather than in one studio. Let me talk about the meatiest part of today's discussion, which is this double battle of pandemic and recession. And as we try to flatten the infection curve, that's going to lead to a steeper recession curve. So, would you say, Michael, that the economic losses from this crisis are going to be greater than any other financial crisis?
Well, I hope this doesn't turn into a financial crisis, but it's certainly a crisis. Let me tell you sort of my view on that. I think that, first of all, I agree with Chen Long that we, in a sense, don't have a choice. I mean, in theory, there's a choice, which is don't do too much and, let the virus run its course, and then you're semi-immune and get on with life. And I just think the human cost of that, the number of grandparents we'd lose, the number of people who are vulnerable, ranging from health conditions to pregnant women, is such that, that's just a choice that most societies can't and won't make. So if you accept that for a moment, then I think you do have to shut a whole lot of stuff down. And to be perfectly honest, and if you do that, then you're going to have and it's sufficiently broad-based globally, then you're going to have a very, very deep drop. So I think that's inevitable. I even think it's inevitable even if you don't have very stringent restrictions imposed at the governmental level, because to be perfectly honest, while there's irresponsible behavior everywhere, we see it here, and I think some of the restrictions we have are a result of that, trying to shut it down. But the truth is, the vast majority of us are sort of anxious and scared and worried about our friends and family and the society in general. And we're going to start exercising, we as people, we as companies or leaders of companies are going to start making choices that amount to social distancing. And when that gets deep enough, you're going to get the same effect economically. So I think, but my personal view is that that's inevitable. And the main issue is, can you do this in such a way that it doesn't produce a large amount of permanent damage so you can recover quickly? I think that the focus of the economic policy side of this should be to make sure that you don't do too much. Let me give an example. It's long ago. In the Great Depression, banks failed, and then they couldn't lend to businesses who just needed a little money to keep going, so they failed. And then the whole thing fell apart. And the way to now, I think there's fairly general agreement among economists, I don't know if Chen Long agrees with me, that circuit breakers that would have prevented the massive bank failures and the massive bankruptcies would have significantly, not eliminated, but reduced the magnitude of the Great Depression effect. And similarly, in this case, airlines, restaurants, hotels, lots of shops where people, might get infected, they're all shut down. I had an entrepreneur of a kind of mid-level luxury brand tell me, he's the owner and founder of the company, that the sales are zero, just flat out zero. They operate all over Europe and even globally. So the trick is to do the best job we can in making sure that all those businesses don't fail, and the people that used to work there and may not be able to work are protected enough so that when we don't have the virus problem, we can snap back.
So, Professor Chen, the principles of stimulus right now seem to be timely, targeted, and temporary. We're seeing tax holidays. We're seeing, giving right out money. We're seeing, just a number of things being rolled out. What do you think would be most effective in, for example, Italy's case, which has very weak economic fundamentals? You know, how should the EU support Italy?
Yeah. So firstly, I think it has just become clear as within the last week or so, the world is getting into a huge storm right now. We're getting another stage. So we have to reevaluate something we didn't imagine that much is happening right now. Now, for us to evaluate those, what are the good policies, we have to first think a little bit about the nature of this problem. So as we mentioned earlier, that right now, the nature of the problem is that you have to somehow have a kind of comprehensive slowdown of the economy. And it's not fundamentally different from previous crises. If you think of financial crisis, it was driven by the housing bubble and combined with the weakness of the financial system. Now, previously, in the previous recession in the United States, it was driven by the high-tech bubble. But this time, it's not just a bubble or a sector. We're talking about a complete shutdown of the whole economy in order to
the economy
control
in freezer, as it were.
Exactly, it's put into a kind of freezing area. Let it stop somehow, and that it becomes very problematic. So there are two battles. One is the virus pandemic itself. Then it actually affects the economy, in my view, in four ways, in four channels. The first two channels are the demand and supply. Obviously, when people do not have, it changed the consumers because they don't have income. Then they do not have the mentality. So you see what happened in China in the first quarter is that the world consumption and investment have disappeared. There's no investor, there's no consumer. Well, just every citizens you are trying to escape, So that's it changed on the demand side. There's no consumption to talk about, and there's the very limited investment appetite. And on the supply side, companies, because they have no business, they're going to have huge liquidity shocks. And so this time, because the whole thing is completely shut down, it affects every walk of life. It affects supply and demand from the micro level. It's not just the one sector. So those are the two channels. The third channel is the confidence. The people's confidence was shot in the battle against pandemic. It depends on how much progress or lack of that, how much chaos it created in the battle against pandemic. It will be penetrated into the people's heart, So the consumers, the investors, they're going to lose their confidence, and so that's the third channel. The last channel is the financial channel, is the capital market. So all the three channels will show up in the capital market, as we have observed in the United States in the past 10 days. Also, we have experienced for the breaks, which was unprecedented. Yeah, exactly. It was unprecedented in the whole history. So let's summarize the nature of this whole thing. We're battling two things. In order to control the virus, we have to slow down. And that affects every walk of life, from supply and demand. It shocks people's confidence. It's also reflected in the financial market, and they reinforce each other. So that's the big picture we're facing here. Now, with that nature, let's think about the magnitude of this thing. Just now, Michael just already talked about is the Great Depression. Now, it was the worst case economists tend to think. But if we think about the Great Depression, the worst year, I just checked this afternoon, the worst year, the GDP growth in the United States was negative 12.5%. So that was the worst year. Now, so what's going to happen this time in the worst scenario? We're not quite sure. But if you look at actually China is in a very reasonably good shape right now, because it effectively is controlling the virus. It's trying to get back to normal. But even you think about China, that we are still getting back to the normal of the consumption, of the investment, etc. So we are relatively in a good shape. I think in the long run, it's probably good. We'll get over this. But so you can imagine now. So it's very hard to switch on the economy when you stop it. Now, it's also the whole world is so interconnected. So the first quarter is China. Now, and that will affect the rest of the world. not the second quarter, starting from the rest of the world, Europe and United States. This will affect China. We're so interconnected. So I think this thing will prolong. And it's not that hard to imagine that within a quarter or so, it's going to have a more than 10% decrease. So that could happen, because it's very hard to switch on if we look at the numbers. So that's the we can look at the situation. And
yeah,
I completely
I just want to quickly talk about the limitations of monetary policy, because what we've seen from the US Fed is pretty unprecedented, and yet look at how the market responded. So even before the pandemic, there was just such limited effect for global central banks to act. Take us through that.
Well, so in the West, at least, the markets have been relying on central banks ever since the great financial crisis, because they've been busy essentially lowering the discount rate and elevating the price of risk assets. This wasn't an accident; they did it on purpose. And monetary policy is given credit by most people for being a pretty effective countermeasure, along with some others in the early stages. And there's more controversy about whether it reached the limit of its usefulness or the benefits, exceeded the costs, somewhere in the 10 years since. But I think what you saw this time is that while monetary policy may be an important component of the response that Qianlong was just describing, it's certainly, in this case, not sufficient. I mean, it probably wasn't sufficient before, but in this case, it's really not sufficient, because you can't stop the demand from going away, when people are either scared or ordered to stay at home. So I think what you saw is sort of, the thing that I think cements the argument is that the Fed lowered interest rates essentially to zero, promised to start buying, longer dated debt assets, and then both stocks and bonds went down. Normally, when there's a flight to safety, the flight to safety is into sort of, safer bonds. This time it was into cash. I mean, basically people said, I give up. Now, I have a lot of people now asking me, is this going to just produce a mammoth crash? And I think the answer to that is, we've already lost 30% on the Dow Jones. So, most markets have taken a pretty big hit, but does it mean the whole thing's lost? I mean, I don't really think so, because the fundamentals of this, however difficult the transitions are, is that we're going to recover, and those entities that are traded are going to be back and in business, maybe with a little help from governments in the cases of things like airlines. But so that's my take. Monetary policy is not going to get the job done. Probably in the short run, nothing will get the job done if you mean stop this steep decline that both you and Qianlong have referred to. But if you mean get the job done, meaning protect people and companies and whatnot, so that we can go back to business, then I think then you've got a real policy agenda.
Professor Chen, what about China's new investment plan into so-called neo-infrastructures like 5G, Internet of Things, AI? Is that going to work like the 4 trillion yuan stimulus back in the GFC?
I think, let me follow up on Michael's response first. I think it's crucial. So the situation we're trying to describe here, and I think more and more as we talk, many countries started to use the word war to describe what's going on. And I think that's the right mentality. So because it's so, this time the situation is so complicated. So not a single policy will be sufficient. And you have to maneuver all the resources you can possibly do to deal with this. And so in that way, then you cannot judge so obviously monetary policy is not enough, but I think a lot of people think the US, the Fed cut interest rate to 0%. They thought that, okay, because market went down, that's not effective. I don't think that's the case. Actually, they are doing whatever necessary possibly to do. And you can see that a lot of the things they are doing pretty much like what they do only in the wartime. For example, why do you cut interest rate to 0%? Because you really want the cost of borrowing. You remember what happened in China. So when the economy shut down, a lot of the business, especially small business, now they would need financing support. There's nowhere for them to get it. It's very hard to do that. So that's exactly monetary policy should do. Lower the cost of borrowing if possible. Now that's not enough, but it's much more than doing nothing. So that's how you do this. And so also the Fed is trying a lot to stabilize the financial structure, the infrastructure. For example, buying a lot of the commercial papers, this, that. So essentially that's trying to provide the financial resources for a lot of companies if they want to borrow money. So they're trying to supply the liquidity. So let me come back to what Michael said. I think this is in the long run, this is still just a pandemic. So presumably things will come back to normal. So if you do not want to prolong this, what's crucial there are several keywords. One is the income. So you have to supply people with income, especially the poor people, let them to survive, to have some kind of money. Another word is employment. If people lose their jobs, like in the Great Depression, within a year, United States, it has more than 10,000 banks shut down, and that's going to really prolong the crisis. So you have to keep the business going. You have to give them provide the liquidity support. So income, employment, survival of the business, and liquidity are the keywords. And that's how you can see that's the crossbar. Most of the countries are doing very similar things. Now China is kind of is doing already been doing a lot of the similar approach. In the meantime, because you don't have the consumers, then you have somebody has to spend. So then, if you want to spend, you'd like to spend that can support a sustainable future. That's why China is trying to initiate large-scale investment programs. That's trying to update our technological infrastructure. That is and that's good when you think about it, if you have to spend money. But I think in the short run, and that I still believe that's still the case in China. How to give people income, the average people and the business, especially the small business, to let them business to continue and to support the employment, to support the survival of the business and the liquidity. That's still the biggest challenge in any of the country, including China.
Yes, SME is definitely one of the weakest spots as corporate defaults. Michael, what do you think of these calls for coordinated action, for example, among G20, as opposed to just everyone making their isolated efforts?
Well, it comes at various levels. I mean, I think that the coordination is really a good idea. And I would say if you were giving the global economy a grade on coordination in this context, it would be relatively low, at least up until now. But there are exceptions. I think, and I'm kind of proud of this, that the scientific community, the scientific and medical community globally is talking to each other and working collaboratively really hard. To sort of produce, solutions, analysis, and so on. Everybody from epidemiologists to people who are developing, are trying to develop vaccines and so on. So I think they have a habit of collaborating, with each other and ignoring borders, and that's a good thing. And they're still doing it. China has, as it turned the corner, has been trying very hard to help out other places. We had a delegation of very senior Chinese scientists and doctors come to Rome in Italy to share their experience and help Italy respond to this crisis. And so I think so we don't want to paint a bleak picture of this, but I think the sort of short summary is all of that's a good thing and we should see more of it. And that's on the medical side. On the economic side, you can say much the same things, right? Central banks tend to be reasonably good at talking to each other when it matters, and I imagine they're doing it again. Europe has always got this problem, right? This is this was a situation in which when it became clear that there was an issue, a health problem of major proportions in China, what you would have expected in an ideal world is the European Union, which has completely free movement of people in non-crisis conditions, would have said, okay, we better think about A, how are we going to deal with the borders? And B, how are we going to handle, differential impacts? If they come in the south, in Spain and Italy, are we going to deploy the cross-border mechanisms we have for helping out or not? And that's starting to happen now, but it's really slow. And the coordinated, approach to this new coronavirus at the start just simply didn't occur at the European level. Every country had their own flying restrictions. I mean, I'll give an example and stop. Italy stopped certain kinds of flights they deemed dangerous, and everybody else flew into Frankfurt or Zurich or London and then flew into Italy. I mean, it was just, when you think about it, kind of
a joke.
Ineffective, yeah.
Yeah. Professor Chen, you said the need to bring out the big guns, right, for fiscal stimulus and monetary. But how's all this going to be paid for? I mean, we're already sitting on $235 trillion of global debt.
Big number.
Let me first follow up a little bit with the Michael. So I think that's why it's just so hard to coordinate, and it's testing really the wisdom, our collective wisdom is that you have to, in order to fight those two battles, you have to switch off and on all the time. So, and it's very hard to decide when to switch off and when to switch on and what's the balance. So that's the hard part. Now, so come back to your hard question, and it's very hard to answer this question, but I think at all time, you really wants to survive. And no matter how the government want to spend it, it's really everybody's money. And I agree that it's already has a relatively high debt, the problems across in many countries. But I think there's a consensus here that if we don't want to prolong this, if we don't want to drag a potential recession, which is probably already happening right now, into a depression, then we have to let the business to survive, let people to continue. So that probably is the most urgent. That's all like demand. So otherwise, on top of that, then let's worry about how to spend money prudently. And that's why you see a lot of the strange approach right now. Some countries announce that, well, you're going to be guaranteed your wage. You're going to have a lot of the insurance, this or that. So really, it's really, I'm going to provide you cash. All those measures are very wartime-like measures. But I agree, there's always this issue of the long-term burdens. But I think this is what you necessarily do. Now, let me add a last point here that I think Michael briefly mentioned this, and I agree with him. So thus far, actually, there's no, we have a lot of challenge, but thus far, there's no major component of the financial infrastructure that was affected that much. So based on that, we would think this is thus far, it doesn't look like it is a financial crisis. We hope not. So we're trying to get through the short end. Yeah.
Okay, Michael, I've been reading all these articles. Some say the EU can issue a pandemic bond. Emerging markets with high foreign debt can get emergency funding from institutions like the IMF. What do you think?
They're moving in that direction. I mean, you can quibble about the details, but they have emergency funds that were used in the Euro crisis that they appear to have decided to make available in this context, at least for certain purposes. They've relaxed the rules that restrict fiscal deficits so that countries can respond to this. So, it may be not a full-blown kind of program, of the type that you could design on paper, but they're definitely moving in that direction. I think the criticism would be not that they're being stubborn about it anymore, but that we're a little late, and we do need just people. We need countries to help each other, right? I mean, within Europe and across the globe, we have shortages of everything, right? Depending on where you are, face masks, in various places, ventilators. I mean, are the obvious kind of example. I mean, in the United States, which probably ought to be able to handle this on its own, there are places where they don't have the proper attire, for the medical people to operate safely in taking care of the coronavirus patients. So it isn't just international cooperation, but I think China can ramp up production. If we had a world in which we were used to cooperating with each other rather than one where we were used to fighting with each other, we would say, well, that's great. And, everybody give China a lot of kudos, and there'd be several million masks heading out into the global economy, including the developing countries, which we probably want to come back to because they're really vulnerable right now.
Okay. So if we see all this economic pain, do you think it's going to lead to this knee-jerk reaction of protectionism? We're already hearing the US saying that they need to strengthen their domestic, production of medical supplies and so on. Are we going to see countries, turning more inward with their supply chain?
This may be Qianlong and I can both talk about that. This may be excessively optimistic and hopeful. But I hope this experience leads us over time to reverse course and start to move back toward a much more cooperative approach, because we've been saying it, but this is just such a clear example. We face common challenges, stability, sustainability, pandemics and other things that clearly have a global character to them. Unless you just not balkanize, but fragment the global economy so much it's unrecognizable. So my hope is, the bottom line is, my hope is that this will be a stimulus to move in the direction of increased cooperation, at least in areas where it really matters.
Qianlong, come in on this.
Right. I think this will be a big test on the trust we've been built in the past cooperation. So there was a famous another Nobel Prize winner, Ronald Coase. So he has this famous theory in the boundary of the firm. So basically, he's saying that a lot of time, why don't we do everything within a firm, because it's not efficient, right? So you're going to do something within, and you can leave the market to do something else to do the collaboration. But actually, behind this whole system mechanism, there's a certain level of trust. What is happening is that at the crisis time, people realize that trust is kind of vulnerable. So sometimes it can be shut down. For example, supply chain. You're going to have a cost components, 100 components can be separate, produced in many countries. Suddenly you find that if you're losing a key component, you cannot put things together. And also a lot of countries find that they have some critical medical components, supplies that are not produced domestically. And people start to worry about this. So for national security reasons and for the supply chain for business reasons, and there's this also pressure, to shorten the supply chain, to have more things that are self-made. So I think there's certain needs for the strategical focus on domestic importance. But on the other hand, and we also realize, as Michael pointed out, that we're so integrated for now. And in both battles, the battle against the pandemic and the battle against the economic recession,
we need to work together.
Exactly. This is like a rolling thing. Think about what's happening in China to the rest of the world. When the rest of the world will also affect China, we're not separable. And China cannot stop the virus. Virus ignore the borders. So you just have to work together. So it is possible And so this really comes down to, do we have the right vision and the leadership? Can we coordinate with each other? So I guess we have to in the end. So we hope we pay a smaller cost for that. But I think it's possible in the end. We realize that we just have to rely on each other. So in the end, probably we can still maintain that trust. In that way, we're still in an integrated world. But it really is dynamic. It's past driven. It depends on how we act in those two battles again. In those battles, yes.
Okay, let's talk about the US stock market reaction, because one thing we don't want is, to see a market crash. So do you think that the recent turmoil that we've seen is an overreaction? I mean, do we see further downside? I was speaking to Howard Marks, the legendary investor, and he says there should be, we're halfway there in the sell-off. And is the US rescue package enough to stop it from crashing further? Michael?
No, that is, I mean, I guess this is in the category of one just doesn't know. But I've heard that there's first of all, there's a lot of investors with a lot of cash out there. And at some point, they're going to decide that these prices are pretty reasonable in a way they just simply probably weren't, a month and a half ago or whenever it was that we hit the high point in most of these indices. And they're going to start buying. They're going to be people like Warren Buffett, but there are a whole lot of others. It may be kind of sector specific. They may be a little more reluctant to dive into airlines, depending on what the government does, or oil and gas, which has some idiosyncratic characteristics of its own, and so on. But the bottom line is, I mean, what I tell my friends and relatives, as well as anybody else who's interested, is I don't think this is a thing without a floor, because unless you think that this is catastrophic as opposed to a tremendous hit from which you have a recovery of unknown duration, I guess is the way I would say it. So I don't know where the floor is. I mean, I've heard speculation that there's people out there who think when the Dow Jones industrial average gets to 18,000, you probably should be flipping the switch and being in buying mode. But whether that's correct or not, or Howard's right and it has to go down more, that's above my pay grade.
Professor Chen, do you agree that it's not a catastrophe and it's not going to change life as we know it? So there will be a flaw.
I think that if you look at historically in the recessions, it's very normal for the stock market in the United States to drop by 20–30%. And the bad part right now is that there's a lot of uncertainty because we don't know what's going to happen. And you see, they don't see the precise flow, and that's the problem. So they don't know to what scale the economy will be shut down and for how long. And so that is very hard. So the stock market, the investors tends to be very agile and agitated. So they are greedy, but then escape very fast, but they could come back. The problem right now is that the trajectory is not very clear. It's very hard for them to know what is going to happen next. So I think, and that turbulence, I think it's going to last for a while in the next several weeks until it becomes clear. So I think that is a very bad period. But I kind of agree with this flaw because fundamentally, this is like a really, really long holiday and it's going to be shut down. But there's no parts going to be necessarily will be permanently damaged. So then that trajectory, how we react to this, how coordinated becomes crucial.
Michael, as we face this major health crisis, do you think we're seeing this failure in market-based models? We're seeing people hoarding, we're seeing people profit from short positions. And, do we need more investments in public goods like healthcare, like family care, even more even public sector involvement in pharmaceutical development?
Yeah, I think we're going to make changes in this respect. It varies a whole lot, from one place to the next. So In Europe here, one of the strengths is that the social security systems and service systems are pretty well developed. Now, they, I just said a moment ago, they're also under pressure. That would be true of Italy as well. I think in places that, where they're less well developed, like say in the West, the UK and the United States, there's going to be real interest in expanding in a number of dimensions. Preparedness for sure, programs. If we're going to work remotely, childcare is kind of a big deal, right? Now you may have to close it down for a little while and put up with all the things that kind of go along, inconvenience and that kind of thing. But I do think, when we come out, maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I think we'll come out of this with a revised sense of what's a sensible batch of sort of economic and social infrastructure to have. And it'll flop over into other things. I mean, Chen-Long mentioned it. I think countries, the non-cooperative version of this is, a little more deglobalization, so we have digital technology pushing us along, and then we had a trade war, and then just about the time we ended chapter 1 of the trade war, we have this pandemic. It's hard to convince yourself that there won't be some level of rethinking of the extent of interdependence, at least in some sectors and dimensions. So kind of that's where I am. But yeah, I think going back to the way we were, I think is a very unlikely outcome.
Professor Chen, do you think this change will happen in the US, where we still have 27 million people without health insurance?
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael that there probably will there needs to be a better balance between we need better leadership. So basically, and if it's only left to the market, sometimes it's very hard to achieve that. So I think in the future, we probably need to think better about what's the best structure of the governance, probably some balance between the government and the market-based approach.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of recovery, when and how do economies be prepared for that phase?
We can both take a shot at this. This is going to sound harsh because it basically amounts to sort of framing the question by giving up on the health side. So suppose we fail to limit the extent of the infections, and we really just do have a pandemic, an uncontrolled pandemic. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I would imagine that would run at fairly high speed through the world, and it would, produce an enormous amount of human damage, deaths, and whatnot. But it wouldn't last forever, right? So, even if we fail, it seems to me by the end of the year, we will probably, this calendar year, we'll have kind of run through the lion's share of it, at least in the big parts of the global economy. Now, that's not my hope for outcome, and I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but it does kind of put a limit on both the magnitude of the thing and its duration. Then how fast we recover after that, I think, are the things that both Chen-Long and I and you have been trying to talk about for the last hour or so, which is we can either let a lot of damage that's semi-permanent occur, we can try to prevent it from happening in multiple dimensions. And if we do a good job of that, then I think we can, even if it's global, right? So China, tourists stop coming, big hit all over the place because they're really important and there are a lot of them and they have a lot of money now, and then China recovers and we go and stop traveling and spending, and buying stuff, and China's, export sector gets hit in a way you didn't anticipate even kind of a month ago. Even if you take into account all of those things, I think, we're probably talking about a year of pretty abnormal experiences, both in human and economic terms, and then I would imagine we'll be in moving back towards some new normal with the adjustments we talked about.
Does that time frame sound reasonable to you, Professor Chen?
it's very hard to nail down the precise time frame. What has become clear right now is that this pandemic thing has become it's going to have a huge economic impact. So it has become clear. We look at Europe and the United States. So I think the key is to how do you balance those two battles, because they have exactly the opposite needs. One wants a lot of activity. One have to restrict activity, and also the world is interconnected. So then that means it won't go away very quickly. Then how do you have limited activity and yet in the same time you are going to have the economic prosperity? So that's going to test a lot of our wisdom. And in the best scenario, probably it's just a couple of quarters thing, and so or just even one quarter, you know. So, but that's really it's very hard to see. I think we're going to learn a lot more on two things. One is that how fast is spreading in the rest of the world outside of China, in Europe and the United States, then also the rest of the world. So that's the first battle. We're going to have to learn this in the next several weeks. A second is that even if you kind of control, because it's not going away quickly. Look at China. So even if it's under control, how fast can you let the consumers invest to continue? How many businesses are still there? So both battles we're going to learn that much more in the next several weeks. There are more official statistics coming out, right? So, but I think it's that it could last for several quarters. I'm hoping it's not the worst going to happen. It's become a depression type, but it could last several quarters. It could last much shorter. Maybe at the end of the summer, we become much more optimistic. We'll see.
Okay, now on to the opportunities brought by this pandemic. I want to talk about expanding digital technology's role, and we've seen that play out in China. For example, fintech platforms offering credit to SMEs, robot cleaners, delivery by drones, tracking to help work and businesses resume, and all that. Do you think this is a massive game changer, for example, for digital technology, Professor Chen?
Yeah, I think so. Let me talk about briefly what has happened in the past several months. And you can see that. So this is the first kind of pandemic, or it's the so Chinese experience that it's the digital technology that kind of combine, integrate, unite us together. We share all the pains, wisdom to try to get through the internet to try to nail things down. So collectively we try, and that kind of reminds me about Hayek's concept about market. He's talking about, okay, the essential part of the market is information. It's very diffuse information. We put together the graduate fund what's precise, and that's a lot of time reminds me of this. There's a lot of the fake information, some this or that. It's really annoying, but in the end, somehow everybody learned to deal with it. So it's like information market. But in the end, I think because this kind of shock is so fundamental from micro level, everybody have to collaborate. They have to have certain understanding. How do we teach each other? It's the first time it happened through the internet, I think. So that's the first thing. It's connectivity has changed how we deal with this battle. The second part is the smart decision. So big data. The data has helped us a lot, tremendously, in the contact tracking, identify the live health situation, and I think going ahead, when you want to balance the two battles, you want to know the progress of how much is the virus under control, how much economy is recovering, how the business is hurting, and for the individuals who is really hurt most, you really need to have the data. You really need to have the information. So this is the battle about information. So that I think it's already happening in China a lot. It will continue. Now another part is that you see everybody suddenly realize. You see in China in the past 10 some years, people are debating about is it about how do we embrace technology? A lot of time we think about business model will not change. It's just the tool. Digital technology is a tool. Some other people think about, well, it's not just a tool, it's going to change your business model. So they debate from each other. But this time, there's no debate anymore, because it's not about who's in charge or lead. It's not essential. But what really separates companies, their competence, is how much the digital technology has become a core competence of your business model as a tool and as a business model. You can see that there's not so much in a shutdown economy. Sometimes it's really like a game changer. It forced the consumers, to change their habits. They have to. The traditional habits are shut down. They have to find new outlet, and a lot of business they were forced overnight to move online, to combine the online offline. So that, I think, is the game changer of both the mindset, of the habit of the users, and also for the business, and also about the coordination for the company itself, or the supply chain. So that, I think, is a big game changer. Going ahead, I believe that to win those two battles, from the governance point of view, from the coordination of everybody, including governments, companies, and every citizens, digital technology is going to be the thread that links them all. So I do think it's a game changer.
Michael, do you see the same thing happening in other countries where there's probably more resistance towards digital technology and less embracing of these tools?
I do, yes. I mean, my perspective on what Chen Long was talking about is China is very important, because the digital infrastructure, e-commerce, mobile payments, fintech, and all that is more highly developed there than anywhere. And both in kind of the technological sophistication, but also just penetration. And I completely agree with them that the data are crucial, and society has to make choices about how they're going to use it. But if they just decide they're not going to use it, they're not going to do very well, for sure. My view of this is to try to divide what the impact is specifically in the digital area, especially. But first of all, conduct the following thought experiment. Suppose we had this pandemic spreading globally and no digital technology at all, anywhere, not just in China, right? So no remote working, right? No
information sharing.
No information sharing, no schooling, as long as you've closed the schools.
No.
And my view of that,
yeah.
Well, my view of that is you couldn't shut down an economy. You can't lock down an economy that doesn't have the digital infrastructure, which is just a way of thinking about how important it's become to us. At a slightly more sophisticated kind of behavioral level, I think that basically digital technology has capabilities that need to be exploited, and opportunities for adding, dimensions to well-being in life that are important. But how fast we get there is determined by inertia. Organizations and people don't change instantly. So a lot of my thinking about what the pandemic's going to do is to sort of overcome the inertia, right? There's lots of organizations that I know that said we'll never work remotely until they had to, right? And when you have to, you discover things about it. You may not like them all, but at least you find out this is information again. You find out stuff that you didn't find out before because you just decided not to do it. I mean, I'll resist sort of giving you examples, but I will say kids are like this all the time, right? Do you want to try this new vegetable? Absolutely not, right? And then they try it, and sometimes they like it and sometimes they don't. And Dr. Seuss's, one of his most famous books is precisely about this. It's called Green Eggs and Ham.
Oh, my kids love that book.
Everybody loves that book. And basically, so I think a fair amount, not all, but a fair amount of what we're seeing is essentially an acceleration of change that might have occurred at a much slower pace otherwise.
But as things move online, do you think that's going to widen the digital gap, further disadvantage those without access to internet?
Yes. I mean, it will, and I guess it will also increase the urgency as a priority in places where there is this gap to kind of close it and close it quickly. And I think the good news is that with a reasonable amount of international cooperation and cross-border investment, you actually can close that gap. I mean, it's not so expensive that it's unthinkable to do it with the mobile internet. Costs coming, digital technology in every dimension, costs coming down. I think we can close those gaps, but they're still there within countries and international.
Professor Chen?
Well, I'm gonna on this part, I'm gonna talk a little bit differently. I don't think it's the. It is true that if you do not have access to internet, it could be a problem. But on the other hand, I think the digital technology is really different from the previous technological revolutions. The previous technological revolutions are more like the trickle-down approach. So if you think about it, it's the most wealthy countries, they harness technology, gradually expand. If you think about the steam engine, after steamship, after it was invented, it took about 160 years to reach the Indonesia, like all those Asian countries. If you think about electricity, after it was invented, it took around 60 years to reach Kenya in Africa. So, but you think about digital technology. The majority of the people in the emerging markets, actually, they now have a cell phone. Even in Africa, they actually have access. So if you look at, we learned this in China. The most active users of using for example, Alipay, WeChat, whatever is on the internet, not the most wealthy people. It's the average Joe like us. A lot of other average people, So I think this time, and there's good reason for that, because the nature of the digital technology is to reduce the cost of information. It's so cheap. Everybody can own a phone. Everybody becomes the information producer. They can produce information and exchange information, collectively make decisions. So this time, the majority of a lot of people are in. So I think I'm not worried. It's not a top-down approach. This time it's more like a bottom-up. It's at least a belly up. It's a big belly of people. But I agree that we have to take care of the people who do not have any access to technology. We have to help them speed up that process. But otherwise, in any case, it's different from the previous technology diffusion.
And Michael, I want to talk about the social and governance aspects. We've seen, I guess, lack of global coordination on this pandemic. Do you think global governance is going to improve as a result of this shock? Do you think people will change? They will want bigger and wiser government?
It's very hard to know. I mean, we have a pattern of rising nationalism, at least in the West, rising nationalism, rejection of traditional parties, polarization and fragmentation within society. And so it's a little hard to make a brave prediction and say that'll kind of, fade away.
You've been pretty optimistic so far.
Yeah, I know, but on this one, I'm a little less confident, right? I think that on the America did an about face on international cooperation with the current administration. I don't think they're going to change if they get reelected, but nobody knows what will happen in November. But I think the United States is still a big enough country that if it changes direction in collaboration with the other major players like China, like the leadership in the EU, we could see a rather noticeable shift in the way in which we interact with each other to the better, in my view. I mean, I don't think, being wistful about the system that we had in the post-war period and hoping it'll all come back is realistic. I mean, there's too many things that are driving us apart. There's digital technology's role in national security. There's differential internet regulation that's fundamentally dependent on different, societal values. Those aren't going to go away. I think President Xi Jinping is right. We have to find a way to live with each other, but live with each other with our differences and not hope they go away. I just agree on that. But so we're not going back to something that we're very familiar with, but I think we can, there's a reasonable chance. And I'm not sure I bet my kids' savings on this, but there's a reasonable chance that we're somewhere near a low point in terms of effective international cooperation.
Professor Chen, would you bet your kids' savings on this prediction?
Yeah, we're really at, even before this crisis, before this battle, we're already at a very turbulent time. The world is facing a rebalancing of its orders because the emerging markets are coming up. There's a lot of challenge. There's a lot of inequality issues. Technology is giving us a lot of opportunities. In the meantime, it also disturbs a lot of things. So there's a lot of the different factors, elements are really driving a different direction. It calls for a more proactive government doing something to fix the problems. It also calls for more coordination. So there's really all those things are, it's very hard to predict. And so, but in any case, we do not have a choice. We have to find a new order and a new balance.
What about respect for healthcare workers? I think through this, everyone's becoming almost, a mini epidemiology expert. I think we're now finding how important it is to respect science, and also to have these practitioners who put their lives, on the line for us. Do you think that's something that's going to, accelerate investments in public health and lead to more respect, so on? Michael?
I do. Well, first of all, I think when this is over, we'll probably have, I hope, we have a very big fuss made about the healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and so on, and celebrate them as heroes. I mean, the courage, determination, working when they're dead tired, working with the most difficult circumstances. And I hope that happens everywhere. And secondly, I think we'll have a heightened appreciation broadly in various populations of the importance of what you might call this kind of infrastructure. This kind of, you need to have. I was struck. Let me do it by example. I was very struck by a talk that Bill Gates gave after the Ebola epidemic. He basically said, you don't want to get caught flat-footed, and you need systems. You need people who are trained. You need the scientists. You need them to have access to the senior policymakers and trust, so that they can provide the advice that only they are capable of providing to guide policy choices and so on, and many other dimensions. Doesn't matter what the details are, but he said, so we have that in some areas. We've had it in the nuclear era for a long time, but we don't have it yet globally in health, and specifically with respect to, epidemics that don't respect borders, to use Qianlong's term, and we need it. And as far as I can tell, he gave the speech and nobody did anything about it, except some of the Asian countries that had already had the experience and knew they needed this kind of capability, if you want to put it that way. So that would be another dimension in which I think, you're suggesting correctly that we are likely to take this more seriously than we have in the past.
Professor Chen, come in on this.
Yes, we definitely will respect and love healthcare much more. And I think most of Chinese nowadays are actually watching the videos of those healthcare workers just leaving Wuhan back to normal. And a lot of people are shedding tears because they are really the heroes. And in China, especially in China, healthcare workers, even doctors, are not well paid. So I think they deserve much more. And so they're so crucial. So I think there'll be much more investment. And especially when China is getting life, health becomes much more important. And this time is this all speed up this. So that means this becomes a huge future industry, So I think it's good for the healthcare workers. They should be respected, and that's the future. Another thing we have learned is that we have to respect science even more. And we have learned that you cannot make arbitrary decisions. You cannot hide things. You have to let the experts make decisions. We have to design better systems to deal with unpredictable things, deal with disasters. That happens at the country level, as well as the business level. So I think we'll respect the science. Let it to help us to make smarter decisions.
And on social and lifestyle aspects, Michael, do you think we'll see, for example, more parks, less malls? Do you think people will consume less and save more for, crises like this? Do you think people will be less communal and they'll be more distrustful of strangers?
So on this one, it's just very hard to know, so you wouldn't want to make very precise forecasts, but I think
I'm throwing curly ones out there.
Well, no, I know, and it's good so I think we will change in some respects. We'll understand that there's risks that we kind of underestimated before. On the other hand, we all live in countries that have pronounced distinctive features of lifestyle. Right, a friend of mine who's an entrepreneur here, whose sales have gone to zero, asked me, are people going to behave in a completely different way? Do we have to kind of re-understand our customers? And my answer to that was no. They don't just sell in Italy, but let's take Italy as a case. Italy's a very social place, not uniquely, but very social. Are we all
love to go there?
Yeah, I know, right. Are we all of a sudden going to change? We may change a little bit, but I just think it's very unlikely that, the fundamental characteristics of the culture, family orientation, very social, lots of gatherings, in various contexts is going to go away. So, I'm a kind of, in this dimension, while it's not a perfect snapback, I'm a kind of mean reversion sort of fellow in thinking about how it's going to go. There are specific dimensions in which that we're going to change. I think the way companies operate, will be influenced significantly by their experience with operating remotely, because they'll have a sense of, both challenges and new possibilities. We'll certainly appreciate the importance of the digital infrastructure and kind of be careful of that. We'll leverage it and all kinds of things. But it's just, I guess I wouldn't want to overstate it. I think we'll still be Chinese and Americans and Italians, mostly when we get through this.
Professor Chen?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. If you think about what happened in the last 2 months or so, is Chinese people, are they become more isolated? They don't trust each other, this or that. They experience this whole thing. I wouldn't think so. I think we see a lot of the touching moments. We see that we can be united to solve a lot of problems. So I don't think the trust level is going down. So that's interesting conclusion. So the battle itself is not make us disintegrated. That's good news. But we do have to change our habits. We have to have some kind of safety approach, the health habits, this or that. And also we are forced to change how we connect with each other. Also, we have to switch more to online, this or that, to coordinate. Those things will change. But I think the level of trust, our affection toward each other is not changing. Somehow, I think it's still there, maybe even stronger.
Okay, back to China's role in fighting the pandemic. China, having now contained its own spread, is now donating a lot of supplies to other countries and sharing expertise. So what do you think of China's role in this battle, and what implications does this pandemic have for the Belt and Road Initiative? Michael, you want to go first?
Okay. I think that China, for stepping back, I think for a long time, China has, since it's become big, powerful, and relatively wealthy, has had the intention of being an important positive force especially in the developing world, and especially the part of it that is fallen behind. I don't think that's changed, and I think the pandemic gives it another opportunity, gives the country another and its leadership another opportunity to pursue that in an area that really matters to people, and that will, whatever you think of the ultimate motivation, it will certainly enhance China's reputation. I also think, vis-a-vis, the developed countries, that China's willingness to help in the context of this, especially as it escalates and becomes more serious, is going to be an important influence on how people think about this. So we were on a kind of glide path of thinking about, increasing strategic rivalries and all that sort of thing, and kind of a breakdown in the old order. And I think that those forces, are still, to some extent present, but I think this is a new factor now. I don't have a view about whether this will have a especially important impact in the Belt and Road Initiative or in the new Silk Roads. I kind of think about it more broadly, like.
Okay, and Professor Chen.
I think it's China's responsibility, and because we are here, we experienced this whole thing. We're kind of ahead of the curve, so it is really our responsibility to not let this lesson to be wasted again. We have to be much more proactive. We have to share the information, tell us what other people, what we have learned. We have to supply the medical support, everything we have learned to help other countries. This is our responsibility, my first point. Second, what China does actually I think it will have very important implication for the globalization. If China can play a leadership role to share and help the world, and to show the world that it is possible, and this is the only way we coordinate or help each other. Helping other people is just helping yourself. We are together to solve the problem, then to build the trust system through the battle, then that really helps how people perceive the globalization. If a lot of people left have the feeling that now we are left with no help, we cannot count on the rest of the world. We just have to depend on ourselves. The world will be much more disintegrated. So I think what China is in its responsibility, it's also in its interest in every way, to help the world, especially also for the emerging markets, for the rest of the Asia, for Africa, for those countries that do not have the good medical system and how very populated. So it's really, really we know this already. We have learned enough lessons from China, from other countries. We really should help them more.
And the BRI?
Sorry?
The Belt and Road Initiative?
I think it's a result. It shouldn't be just by design. It should help all the countries. But if you do good things, it will come back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time and insights today. We've got Nobel laureate economist Michael Spence joining us from Milan, Lombardy, Italy, and also from Hangzhou in Eastern China, Professor Chen Long, who's also managing director of the Luohan Academy. So we've talked about this wide-ranging pandemic and how we can fight this double battle of the virus and the recession. And the answer is a globally coordinated effort in terms of both the virus and also the economic response to do whatever it takes. So I opened today's discussion with a Churchill quote. I'm going to end with one. We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who could do us harm. Well, today we sleep soundly because of those brave and selfless healthcare workers who are fighting the virus. So big thank you to all those people, and thank you for joining us for this live stream. I'm Chenglei in Beijing, and hope to see you at the next discussion. Thank you so much, Michael and Professor Chen.
Thank you, Lei.